Mother of an Empire. By Bottle 7. Chapter 6. Once Ophelia entered the forest, she was wrapped in a comfortable silence. Aside from her own breathing, her footsteps, and the creaking of tree branches in the wind, Ophelia could not hear the sounds of the Imperial Army camp any longer. She took a deep breath and the smell of tree sap tingled her nose. Finally, peace and quiet. It felt like ages since she had gotten the chance to just breathe. It had been a while since she had been in a forest this dense. Outside of Flat Trench, where Ophelia had cultivated and tended to the forests for at least a decade. It was rare to see a forest like this as Ophelia had found in her travels through the Spade Dukedom. Any wooded areas near settlements tended to get over-harvested or completely wiped out for expansion. It was almost nostalgic for Ophelia. After all, she had spent most of her life in the woods. It was the closest thing to home she had, while no one in Flat Trench was outwardly hateful to her. Ophelia wasn't blind to the discrimination she had faced. Any time she'd even start to get close to anyone, others would pull them away from her. Ophelia shrugged those thoughts off as quickly as they came. Regardless, she had a job to do. Ophelia reached out, patting a nearby tree. She marveled at the solid and healthy feeling she got from it. "You're all very healthy here." She chuckled, pleased, her eyes scanning the area. It was mostly pine and spruce in the forest, which was to be expected being this far north. What she was looking for was an old dead tree, while ideally anywhere else she'd look for a hickory, being that was the best for campfires and she liked the smell of the smoke. The next best thing was dead wood. It was lighter and the lack of sap meant that it caught fire easier and burned hotter. As she scanned the area, Ophelia's eyes landed on an old creaking tree. It was obviously dead and looked like it was about to fall over at any moment. "I see. Thank you." Ophelia mumbled mostly to herself as she walked towards the tree. As she spun her axe in her hand, there was a rush of wind and the trees creaked audibly. "This needs to be cleared for something else can grow." Ophelia reasoned as if the forest was arguing with her. While Ophelia didn't believe that was happening, this was just a habit she picked up when tending to the woods back in Flat Trench. After all, the villagers didn't prove to be good conversationalists, so Ophelia chatted daily with the plants deep within the forests. The health of the forests of Flat Trench was Ophelia's pride when she was there. Under her watch, the trees grew taller and lusher each year. It felt comforting to Ophelia to do this again. Despite being gone just a few months, being a woodsman was the only thing Ophelia had known. Stopping in front of the tree, Ophelia then began to chop at it. Thuds filled the silence and Ophelia felt herself relax for just a moment. Then her ears perked up, and instantly she pulled her axe out of the tree and froze, listening. Distant sounds of voices getting closer with each passing moment. "I'm telling you guys, there's no way there's anyone from the Imperial Army here. They'd be crazy to come this far north." One young male voice spoke. "You mean like us? It's freezing here." Another male voice complained, "Yeah, well, it's better than being back in Snowfall." The first responded, "Definitely, all those stupid nobles keep getting rid of farms to grow mulberry trees." Yet another replied. Hearing what they were talking about, Ophelia's eyes widened. Snowfall was one of the many enemies of the Imperial Army. It was a kingdom just west of the Spade Dukedom, known for its warm climate and fertile land. But despite that, Ophelia knew from first-hand experience that the kingdom and its nobles weren't interested in using their lands. During her time in St. Gypsum more than once, Ophelia witnessed Snowfall nobles showing up at the church to beg for food for their people. Many times, food was taken from the mouth of the young girls at the church only to be handed over to those nobles. Ophelia, being quiet, saw many things like priests' hands becoming greased by these nobles. Somehow, whenever they were caught in Ophelia's sight, the priests managed to always come up with some sort of godly excuse. Though Ophelia wondered if it was because they were afraid she'd tell or if they felt some sort of shame. Hearing the footsteps come closer, Ophelia slipped behind a large old tree that easily hid her figure. She thought about her situation carefully. Snowfall was one of the many enemies of the Imperial Army. She could very easily slip away now and report the situation to a superior officer. But that would risk them noticing her. Ophelia wasn't exactly the easiest to hide. She closed her eyes, listening carefully, counting how many footsteps. She was sure there were 3 based on the footsteps she heard and the voices from earlier. It was obvious they were a scouting unit just based on the size and how they were wandering about. Ophelia opened her eyes and looked down at her axe. She wasn't afraid to fight, that wasn't the issue was whether the risk of running or fighting gave a good reward. Ophelia, facing towards the camp, distantly saw smoke from between the trees. If they saw the campfire smoke, they'd report it faster than she could. There were more of them than her, the other 2 could easily try to slow her down. While she'd receive pay for partaking in a battle. Ophelia's eyes narrowed. The army chef promised to cook up extra servings for dinner due to the good hunt. If these guys see the camp, they'd signal snowfall and cause a battle. Her grip tightened on her axe. The thought dawned on her then, her day was about to be ruined if these bastards signaled their army. Ophelia sneered, feeling angry. That was something that was unacceptable. Chapter 7. Refusing to let her day be ruined, Ophelia stepped out from behind the large tree. When she stepped out, she stepped into the direct path of the Snowfall men. Ophelia looked stoically at the surprised and shocked expressions on their faces. Counting silently, she noticed 5 rather than the 3 she had counted from their footsteps. 2 of them must have been hunters back home from how soft their walking had been. Instantly, when seeing Ophelia, the men took a step back. The shortest of the lot was shoved to the front. "W. Who are you?" he stuttered out. Ophelia stared at him. He was young with unkempt hair that was pushed back from his face. His lips were chapped from the wind and his face was pale. Ophelia shifted, resting her axe on her shoulders. "Ophelia," she replied frankly. "Ophelia?" He stuttered out. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. "Cutting trees down." Ophelia replied, motioning over to the tree she was working on. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, eyeing the men. If she could just scare them off without problems, then everything would end peacefully. However, as Ophelia motioned to the tree, her coat opened. She's one of the Imperials," a man standing at the back of the group explained. Stiff silence settled over the group and Ophelia frowned deeply. "What a shame." She clicked her tongue, feeling annoyed. "I was going to let you go." She narrowed her eyes. We won't say anything," the man up front stuttered. Ophelia looked just past him and saw his comrades drawing their weapons. "I don't believe you," she replied, irritated. There was nothing more annoying than being lied to. The men from behind the one up front charged her. Ophelia felt a sense of nostalgia wash over her. It had been a while since she had fought a group of men with only her axe. Funnily enough, it was in the woods too. But unlike those men, these men wouldn't walk away with a few broken bones. The sickening ease that Ophelia's axe cut through the neck of one of the men was almost surreal. His head went flying through the air and the men who had charged Ophelia previously froze in their tracks. An archer who had drawn back an arrow accidentally dropped it into the snow. Ophelia towered over the men as she stood to her full height. She felt the blood spatter on her face and she narrowed her eyes. "Be thankful I've sharpened my axe," Ophelia spoke coolly. One of the men dropped his sword and ran, but Ophelia threw her axe and it embedded itself into his head. A gory sight that Ophelia's eyes didn't linger too long on. Ophelia lifted up the abandoned sword and looked at the men. "You should have stayed in Snowfall." Sounds of screaming followed soon after those words left her mouth, and all too soon, the forest went silent. After that, the steady thuds of chopping were heard. Ophelia trudged through the snow with 2 logs on her shoulder. The wood was dead, so it was light. Her axe was in her free hand, clean and gleaming as if it hadn't just been used for its original purpose. Ophelia looked up at the grey sky momentarily. It was such a nice day, she thought to herself. A frown formed on her lips after a moment. It was. But not anymore. After that brief moment, Ophelia continued walking towards the camp. With each step she took, she left behind bloody footprints in the white snow. Even her long coat left a sickening red trail behind her. Ophelia ignored the smell of copper coming off of her, deciding that could wait until after she got the firewood ready. As Ophelia entered the camp, she ignored the stares she felt from other soldiers who caught sight of her. She was well aware she had blood on her face still. She made her way over to the woodpile and took a brief moment after setting the logs down to wipe her face and hands with a rag. She pulled from her jacket pocket. Using the snow to wet it, it was quick work to straighten her appearance up. She then began to chop the logs up until usable firewood. As she worked, Spencer Spade, Ophelia's commanding officer, approached. "Cadet Reeds, where have you been?" he asked, looking frustrated that she had gone missing. Yet again. Ophelia held back her amusement. It was sort of fun watching the small alpha man become frustrated with her. Even if she didn't care for his naggy rants that he often went on. "Chopping wood," Ophelia replied, motioning to the small yet growing pile of wood in front of her. "Why?" Spencer questioned, a bewildered look on his face. "I was told we needed some." Ophelia shrugged. Spencer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "That was Johnson's chore today. Ophelia felt Spencer's eyes scan her body before snapping back up to her face. Did the trees bleed?" he asked in a humorous tone. "Trees don't bleed, Spade." Ophelia replied, shaking her head. "They could have red sap." Spencer argued. "This kind of tree doesn't." Ophelia replied, "Then what is that on your uniform and coat? Did an elk bleed on you?" he asked, motioning to her. "No." Ophelia looked down at herself, feeling annoyed. It would take forever to get rid of those stains. Spencer opened his mouth to question her some more, but Ophelia spoke up. "But the soldiers from Snowfall did." Ophelia spoke nonchalantly. "Oh, that makes sense." Spencer replied. Ophelia shrugged and turned to chop more wood. As she raised her axe, Spencer explained, "Wait, what?" he shrieked, his voice raising an octave. Ophelia lowered her axe, wincing. "What do you mean the soldiers from Snowfall bled on you? Why would they bleed on you?" Spencer shrieked. "Well, they were dying." Ophelia replied, exasperated. "Why were they dying?" Spencer's voice cracked. "I was killing them." Ophelia deadpanned. "You do realize we're in an army, right?" Ophelia stuck her axe into the log. Spencer grabbed fistfuls of his hair, pulling. "Why did you kill them?" He looked like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. "They were a scouting group and they drew their weapons on me," Ophelia replied frankly. Spencer stared at her, opening and closing his mouth. He then took a deep breath. "Well, at least you defended yourself," he spoke to himself. "Where are they now?" he asked. "Same place I found them." "In the woods. They're not going anywhere." Ophelia shrugged. Spencer gawked, staring at her. Ophelia stared. Are you breathing?" Ophelia questioned, not seeing a trail of mist leave his lips. A long trail then left Spencer's lips as he exhaled loudly. He ran his hands down his face with a low groan. "How many?" he asked, his hands cupping his mouth. "5." Ophelia replied. "5?" His voice was muffled but loud. "You're just a cadet." He clearly had a headache, Spade. Ophelia spoke. Spencer, who was staring at the ground, looked up. Ophelia stood to her full height and stared at him with a raised eyebrow. "Ah. Right." He stuttered. In the time that Ophelia had joined, Spencer had gotten good at understanding her mostly wordless replies, often serving as a translator if Ophelia couldn't be bothered to explain things to others. Though that skill was mostly developed out of survival, or so Spencer claimed. "Are you sure they aren't going anywhere?" Spencer questioned. Ophelia turned back to her work chopping wood. "It's just like I told the commander, whether it's a sword or an axe." Ophelia pulled her axe out of the log. "People tend to die if you hit them hard enough," she observed, staring at the sharp blade of her axe, "or if you cut off the right parts." She added, then brought the blade down, splitting the log in half. Ophelia glanced over at Spencer, feeling satisfied with her explanation. This should serve as a good enough report, right? The much smaller alpha man stared at Ophelia with a conflicted expression. He was about to speak when "Officer Spade! Officer Spade!" Another cadet ran up, looking pale in the face. "Some psychopath cut off all the heads of some soldiers in the woods," he reported as another cadet followed after, looking like he was barely holding back his breakfast. "It was horrible," he cried behind his hands. His face was green. The cadet rushed behind a nearby tent, loudly throwing up. Spencer's conflicted look faded and a much more familiar, annoyed look appeared. "Sweet Holy Mother!" he grumbled, pinching the bridge of his nose. I told you they weren't going anywhere. Ophelia joked. However, the commanding officer didn't find her joke funny and glared. You're way too casual about this, he pointed at her. How many people have you killed? He questioned. Ophelia raised her brows before deadpanning. Only 5 that you can prove. Chapter 8. Spencer gawked at Ophelia, stunned she'd be so brazen to say, 5 that you can prove. Ophelia tilted her head, confused. Spencer covered his face with his hands, letting out a frustrated, muffled scream. Spade? Ophelia questioned, her eyebrows high on her forehead. What the hell was his problem? Then, suddenly Spencer grabbed her hand. Where are we going? Ophelia questioned as Spencer pulled her behind him. We need to report this, Spencer announced, dragging the larger alpha woman behind him. Ophelia was unsure what he meant by report until she spotted the strategy tent. Her eyes widened, and she dug her heels into the snow. To Spencer's credit, he was able to drag her with some ease until Ophelia actually put strength into her resistance. Spencer's quick pace stopped, and he pulled on her once and then twice before turning to look at her. Damn it, Ophelia! He swore, looking frustrated with her stubbornness. What the hell is your problem? He snapped. Ophelia looked to the tent and then back to Spencer. I can't go in there. She refused flatly. Spencer had tried to pull her again and then paused. Why? He asked with an exasperated tone to his voice. He had looked so full of energy moments ago, but now looked like he was exhausted. I have blood on my coat and uniform, Ophelia said, holding up the part of her coat stained a dark red. She was thankful that her uniform was red, so it wasn't as easily spotted, but the smell of copper lingered on her. In Ophelia's experience, important people didn't like it if you showed yourself in front of them while being dirty. Ophelia was just about to suggest giving her a few minutes to clean up, but she closed her mouth, seeing the furious look on Spencer's face. His eye twitched visibly and he glowered. Are you fucking with me? He asked in a dangerous tone. Ophelia furrowed her brows. No. She replied frankly. Spencer looked suddenly calm after a moment, but Ophelia felt murderous intent radiate off of him. Ophelia met Spencer's unwavering gaze curiously. If the little man thought he stood a chance at killing her, she'd certainly like to see him try. Spencer's steady gaze faltered, and he let out a long sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. Every day. He spoke, rubbing his face. You take another year from my life. He sounded exhausted. Please. He looked back at Ophelia pleadingly. Just this once. He grabbed her arm. Go into the tent with me. Ophelia furrowed her brows. You make it sound like I'm difficult. Ophelia wasn't sure if she should be offended. Spencer let go of her arm and she saw his eye twitch yet again. You are beyond difficult, Ophelia. He was clearly annoyed. Every day I pray to the heavens for mercy or death. You've made me a religious man, Ophelia. Spencer snapped. I'm not that bad, I think I'm pretty reasonable. Ophelia defended herself, feeling offended. You've started weekly fights with General Lewis. Spencer exclaimed. Well, how do you expect me to train? Ophelia argued. You carried a donkey across a river. Spencer's tone rose in pitch. Mabel was scared. We had to get her across somehow. Ophelia! Spencer shrieked. Yes? Ophelia asked. Please, I'm begging you, just listen to my orders just this once. Spencer pleaded. Ophelia looked at the exhausted look on Spencer's face. She noticed a wrinkle forming on his forehead. That wasn't there before. Ophelia sighed. Should I take off my coat? She asked. Her coat was the worst part of her outfit. Sure. Yes. Just go into the tent. Spencer shouted. He was at his wit's end at this point. Ophelia slipped off her coat and hung it off her arm. All right, Ophelia remarked, heading towards the tent. She paused momentarily, feeling strangely nervous. What would Darius think? She shook her head, finding the feeling ridiculous. The Omega commander likely hadn't even thought of her lately. She was sure the novelty of her presence in the army had faded, and she was just one of the many faces at this point. With that thought settled, Ophelia lifted the flap and ducked into the tent. Standing up at her full height, the talking that had been going on ceased, and she looked around, seeing all the generals gathered with Darius. There were 5 generals in total in the army. Ophelia had already previously met General Spade and General Lewis. While she had not met the others in person, she was well aware of who they were. General Hart was easy to spot with his long blonde hair and thin frame. General Leroy had sharp features and messy brown hair. General Duval had narrow eyes and a thin face, honestly reminding Ophelia of a snake. All 6 people present stared at her, surprised that she would just walk in. "Cadet, I realize you may be new to the army, but there is a protocol to entering the strategy tent." General Hart scolded, looking displeased. "I'll pull the stick out of your ass, Hart." Lionel snapped, hitting his fist on the table. He then stood up. "Give me a few minutes, kid, and then we can go tussle in the fighting pit." Lionel looked excited to see Ophelia. "Ah." Ophelia started to say, "She's not here to fight." Spencer exclaimed from behind Ophelia. She stepped aside, letting the commanding officer in. "Don't encourage her, General Lewis. I have my hands full as is." Spencer pleaded. "I was behaving." Ophelia defended herself quietly. "Spencer, please don't take this away from Lionel. It's the only thing he looks forward to." General Spade spoke up. Spencer groaned. "Father." Clearly exasperated with the amused look his father was giving him. Ophelia heard some quiet swears leave Spencer's lips, and she looked around, studying the inside of the tent. Her eyes landed on Darius sitting sideways in a high-back chair. The two of them made eye contact, and Darius gave her a smug look. As Spencer and his father bickered, Darius mouthed the words, "Did you miss me?" Ophelia felt her face go hot. She had thought, maybe even hoped, that Darius would have forgotten about her. If he did, this certainly got his attention back on her. Sneering despite the flush on her cheeks, Ophelia mouthed back, "In your dreams." Before looking away, a chuckle left the Omega's lips. Vaguely listening to the argument for a couple more moments, Darius then spoke up. "As much as I'm enjoying watching this family reunion, Officer Spade." Darius spoke up. Ophelia looked back at Darius. "Why are you here, Reeds?" He asked. Ophelia rose her eyebrows, surprised he remembered her name. Important people like Darius usually had their attention in 1,000,001 places. It was only natural for Ophelia to assume that she had lost Darius's attention to other important matters. Then again, based on that little comment he mouthed at her earlier, it's likely she never lost his attention in the first place. She was about to speak, but Spencer spoke up, stepping forward. She dashed. Spencer was quickly cut off by Darius. "I asked Reeds the question, Officer Spade." The alpha man faltered visibly and took a step back next to Ophelia. He then looked up at her and nudged her. Ophelia stared down at his meaningful look. Ophelia could only guess what nonsense he was nagging her about in his head now. Ophelia then took a breath. "Well," she spoke, "it looks like you've got 5 bodies to prove I've taken a life," Ophelia announced. Chapter 9. Ophelia heard coughing and looked over to see that General Hart had choked on his own drink. General Leroy, who was sitting next to him, looked like he was on the verge of tears as he covered his mouth, holding back his laughter. Lionel shamelessly laughed upon hearing Ophelia's response. General Spade chuckled, watching Spencer groan, holding his face in his hands. The only 2 unaffected by her announcement was Duval and Darius. Duval seemed apathetic to the situation, while Darius seemed amused. A pleased look appeared on the Omega's face, and his eyes twinkled with excitement. "That so?" he asked in a libidinous tone. He sat up straight, leaning his face on one of his hands that rested against the armrest. The flirtatious tone was not lost on anyone in the tent. Ophelia noticed the startled and slightly uncomfortable looks that the others had. Cocking an eyebrow, feeling just as confused as everyone else, she replied, "Yeah," in the most casual tone possible. Ophelia felt Spencer's glare dig into the side of her face. She could almost hear him nagging about how she couldn't just be so casual with the commander. But Darius seemed unbothered by her tone and gave her a toothy grin. "Who'd you kill?" he asked. "Soldiers from Snowfall," Ophelia replied. Everyone, staring at their exchange, was beginning to feel annoying. Not that Ophelia wanted to speak with Darius in private or to have him to herself. It just felt like everyone thought she was flirting back. She was just making a report. That's all. Nothing more. "How do you do it?" Darius asked, scanning her body. His eyes stopped at the coat that hung on her arm. It was so darkly now, and Ophelia could still smell copper radiating off of her. Turns out I was right, an axe is just as good as a sword. Ophelia replied a bit sarcastically. Darius snorted hearing this. You killed 5 soldiers with just an axe. Ophelia turned and saw the surprised look on Leroy's face. Yes. It's all I had on me at the time. I was gathering firewood. Ophelia replied before looking back at Darius. Where were you? Darius questioned. In the forest just south of the camp. The soldiers came from the east in the forest. Ophelia replied. They looked like they were a scouting unit, so I thought it was best to get rid of them, Ophelia added. Don't you think it was a little cruel to just kill them? Ophelia turned to see a disgusted look on General Hart's face. Not unsurprising, Hart was best known for his diplomacy. He usually was used in the army to meet with nobility or create alliances. It was expected that someone who preferred a pen to a sword would find the cruelty of war disgusting. But for Ophelia, it was no different than hunting. Because in the end, it was either her or them. They drew their weapons. Ophelia defended herself. Also, if I let them go, they would have reported our position. I could see the campfire smoke from the forest. She added, narrowing her eyes slightly. But still you could have dash. Hart tried to argue, but Darius spoke up. We're at war, Hart. At least Reeds understands that. Darius glared at the general. If she would have kept them alive, they would have run their mouths. Darius scolded, sitting up straight and crossing his legs. It's better to wet your hands with the enemy's blood than let your people's blood be spilled. Lionel put in his 2 cents as he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Hart shrunk in his seat, looking annoyed. Ophelia felt pleased that he got the message. She turned to look back to Darius, but went stiff when she saw the coy look on his face. With his legs crossed and the tips of his fingers grazing his lips. He grinned up at her with half-lidded eyes. Ophelia felt her eye twitch. Either he was really trying to flirt with her or he was fucking with her. Can I dash? Ophelia tried to ask if she could leave. It was hard to stand there and pretend to be unaffected by the looks Darius was giving her. You know Reeds. Darius spoke, cutting her off before she could ask. You're the first alpha woman in the army. He remarked. Ophelia took a breath. I managed to gather that. Ophelia deadpanned. Ophelia. Spencer scolded, and a dirty look was shot Spencer's way by Darius. The Omega was visibly angry at Spencer for speaking up. Ophelia glanced at Spencer, who looked pale under Darius's glare. I've been doing some reading. Darius spoke up a bit louder, getting her attention on him again. Okay. Ophelia was unsure where this was going. Or why Darius thought now was the time to chit-chat. What did you read about? Ophelia tried to be involved with the conversation. Obviously he was going somewhere with this. She was too curious not to respond. Well, Darius uncrossed his legs and recrossed them in the opposite direction. I read that it's common for alpha women to get names after things that almost killed them. Darius motioned to Ophelia. Is that true for you? He questioned. Ophelia stared at Darius, feeling annoyed by being on the receiving end of whatever this was. She decided to meet his energy and smirked. Are you asking me if my parents tried to drown me? She asked, walking towards him. She closed the distance and stood mere inches in front of Darius. The Omega man smiled and looked up at her, resting his chin on his hand. Well, when you put it like that, it makes me sound rude. Darius replied with a smile on his face. Ophelia snorted and folded her arms, leaning towards him so she towered over him. Do I look like someone that can happen to? She asked. Cadet. Ophelia heard harsh warning whispers from behind her. She ignored them. They could stay out of this. This was between her and the little man in front of her. But rather than being offended by Ophelia's brash behavior, Darius's smile grew. He tilted his head up towards her. You're a little tall, why don't you lean down and say it? He retorted with a thickly flirtatious tone to his voice. Sure, Ophelia replied, placing her hands over Darius's head as she leaned down. They were nearly nose to nose when General Spade cleared his throat. Should we give you two some privacy? He questioned. Darius had started to reach for her face and froze in place as if he had forgotten everyone else was there. Ophelia stood up, feeling strange. She had forgotten as well. She wasn't embarrassed, it was just. Ophelia looked back down at Darius. She wasn't usually like this. What was it about this man that did these things to her? Darius eyed Ophelia before sighing loudly. He then went to stand up. Ophelia stepped aside, allowing him the room to do so. Once standing, Darius spoke. "Duval add to Reed's account 2 silver." He announced, "Yes, Commander." Duval replied with a nod. "Why are you adding additional pay?" Leroy questioned. "She took care of something that could have caused a surprise attack, Leroy." Darius replied, headed over to the table with a map of the area spread out on it. He looked down at it, resting his hands on the table. "She also gave us the advantage as well," he added. Ophelia looked over at Darius, watching his eyes scan the table with a grin on his lips. It was different than the usual grins on his face that he gave her. Coy, snide, teasing smiles were usually sent her way by Darius. But this one was scheming, and Ophelia could see the gears moving in Darius's mind just from his expression. At that moment it began to be more real to her that this man was in fact the commander of the army, and his title was not just in name. "Reeds," Darius called her name, pulling Ophelia out of her thoughts. Ophelia perked up, seeing him not even look at her as he beckoned her with his finger. Ophelia approached, standing beside him. "Show me exactly where you were," he demanded. Ophelia scanned the map. "Commander, she probably doesn't even know how to read a map. She's just a cadet." Leroy spoke up. Ophelia glanced up at Leroy before pointing to her exact location. "I was about 10 trees in, so about right here," Ophelia spoke, and the tent went silent. "How do you know how to read a map? Half of our recruits don't even know that." Leroy was bewildered. "I'm as learned as I need to be." Ophelia replied simply. Despite her stoic expression, she felt smug seeing the look on Leroy's face. Their bodies should be next to the 15th tree. With the exception of one, he's near the 20th. Ophelia explained, looking back at Darius. "Why'd he get so far away?" Darius questioned curiously. "He tried to run," Ophelia replied, a slight smile forming on her lips, finding some humor in the gruesome situation. "He didn't make it," she added. "Obviously, some other cadets found your work already." Spencer deadpanned. "That means their camp should be right around here then," Darius spoke, reaching over Ophelia's hand that was still on the map. He glanced up at her out of the corner of his eye before placing a flag near a mountain. "It's a little warm in snowfall. So they're going to be hiding next to anything that can block harsh winds like hills or mountains," he explained. His hand grazed over hers as he moved back. "I see," Ophelia spoke. "I'll keep that in mind," she added, unsure how else to respond. She moved her hand back and another flag was placed where her hand was by Darius. "How do you know that some of them didn't make it?" Hart questioned. Ophelia was about to reply when she felt a hand resting on the small of her back. A brief glance over at Darius told her everything. The commander was trying to pat her on the back, but he was a bit short to reach anywhere while still being subtle about it. "They didn't, trust me," Ophelia decided to reply calmly. Darius's flirting didn't bother her so much when it was subtle like this. "But how can you be sure? I've seen soldiers recover from serious injuries," Hart exclaimed, looking frustrated. "How do you know they didn't just push through an injury and make it back to their camp?" He rose his voice. For some reason Hart had a problem with all the praise Ophelia was receiving. Though Ophelia wasn't sure about the nature of her praise being entirely professional. It'd certainly be exhausting if Darius flirted with every cadet performing well. "I cut their heads off," Ophelia deadpanned, having enough. Hart went pale and Mum heard this. "What?" both Spade and Leroy questioned. "People are surprisingly sturdy despite being fragile. Removing their heads from their necks was the only way I can think of making sure they didn't get back up." Ophelia felt Darius's hand slip lower. She stiffened up and tried to ignore it. His flirtations didn't bother Ophelia by themselves. If they had been alone, his wandering hand would be a different subject altogether. Ophelia's mind briefly flashed to her leaning over him previously. It's likely she'd have him pinned against something by now. Ophelia kept her expression stoic. There was no need to tell everyone what she was thinking by her look alone. "Good job, Reeds," Darius praised her. Ophelia looked over at him, a smug smile on his lips. The little bastard was having too much fun teasing her. Ophelia rose her brows. He was lucky they weren't alone. Ophelia wondered how long his little smug smile would be on his lips then. Then again, judging by how he was acting, that was probably something he planned for. Thanks. Ophelia smiled slightly at him. What a little snake. Ophelia let out a soft breath. He was lucky he was cute. She felt Darius lightly pat her back. Do more good work like this and you'll get even greater rewards. Darius encouraged her. Ophelia perked up hearing this. Greater rewards? Ophelia wondered if this was offered to others as well. Though she got the feeling, the rewards Darius was thinking of weren't quite the same as what was offered to others if that was the case. Ophelia, deciding to tease him a bit, replied, "Money is just fine with me, Commander." Instantly an annoyed expression formed on Darius's face. Ophelia couldn't fight the smile on her lips. That so? He didn't like her response. He looked back to the map and Ophelia held back a snort. Was he pouting? Ophelia certainly didn't want him to think she was refusing him. Despite her annoyance, the little man was fun to play with. But if you choose to reward me in other ways, who am I to refuse? Ophelia decided to be nice for once. No need to humiliate him in front of the other generals after all. Darius glanced back at her, looking a bit more pleased. Good to know. Ophelia felt Darius's hand leave her back. Although a bit slowly, that might have just been her imagination. You're dismissed, Reeds. Darius announced after a moment. Thank you, Commander. Ophelia replied, leaving just a moment after that. Ophelia felt eyes linger on her backside as she left, only stopping when Spencer followed after her. Once outside of the strategy tent, Ophelia took a moment to collect herself. Did she just spend the last 20 minutes flirting with the commander in front of the generals and her commanding officer? Ophelia put her hands on her hips, letting out a sigh at the same time as Spencer. The two of them looked at each other. Did you get the feeling he was? Spencer questioned carefully. Ophelia looked at her commanding officer, considering everything before looking away. Feeling her brow twitch, she smiled despite herself. I should spend more time in forests, she remarked a bit jokingly, though she was sorely tempted. Spencer let out a noise of disbelief. Fucking hell, you too? He groaned, looking instantly like he had a headache. Chapter 10. That day Spencer made Ophelia run a few laps around the camp as punishment for treating the commander and generals rudely. The laps didn't bother Ophelia, it was the hour-long lecture that followed afterward. The lecture only ceased when Ophelia managed to duck away when Spencer got distracted. Finally, having some free time and feeling gross, Ophelia grabbed her supplies and a fresh uniform to go clean up. Finding a river and lighting a fire, Ophelia boiled the water and cleaned herself off with a cloth and some lye. She pulled her hair out of her ponytail, freeing it. She slowly stripped her clothes, only removing what was needed. After all, it was cold. As she cleaned, she dressed in fresh clothes, leaving her tunic off, not wanting water to get on it from her hair. She redressed herself in her breast bindings after cleaning her chest off. Dumping the dirty water on the ground, Ophelia refilled the pot, carefully measuring the heat so she could wash her hair. As she waited, she carefully combed through her hair, removing any dirt or filth as well as any knots. Once the water was ready, Ophelia removed the pot from the fire, setting it on a stone she cleared off, adding in some cool snow to bring down the temperature. She carefully dunked her hair into the pot, rinsing it. Pulling away, she began quickly scrubbing her head with lye soap, massaging her scalp carefully. The scent of rosemary filled the air. Once Ophelia was satisfied, she rinsed her hair in the pot once again. Once free of soap, Ophelia carefully dried her hair with her towel, patting and squeezing out water. Ophelia then pulled a small bottle of olive oil out of her pouch. It had been expensive to get, but she couldn't stand it when her hair got too frizzy. She also didn't like the feeling her hair had when she used walnut oil instead. Using a reasonable amount, Ophelia ran her fingers through her hair before combing her hair once again to spread the oil. Finally, once she was done, Ophelia put her tunic back on and sighed, feeling relieved. The scent of blood no longer lingered on her and was replaced by the smells of rosemary and olive oil. She quietly sat by the fire, giving herself a few minutes to dry off. Once she was done, she packed her things up and used the leftover water to put out the fire. She made her way back to camp with her hair hanging loose instead of pulled back like it usually was. Making her way to the cook's tent, Ophelia noticed the others staring at her. Feeling confused, she ignored it while waiting in line. That was until Lionel came up and smacked her on the back. "Looking awful spiffy, kid." Lionel laughed. "It's called bathing. You should try it sometime, old man," Ophelia retorted. Lionel grinned. "Come on, kid, this is a smell of a grade A alpha." Lionel patted his chest proudly. "I could barely keep omegas and women from me back in my hometown." "Can I assume the name of your hometown is Pigsty?" Ophelia sneered, disliking the sweaty, grungy scent coming from the alpha. Lionel chuckled, putting an arm around her shoulder. "Are you sure you getting cleaned up wasn't to impress a certain commanding omega?" He teased in a hushed tone. Ophelia stared blankly at Lionel. "It was because I don't enjoy smelling of blood and sweat," Ophelia replied flatly. Lionel made a sour face. "You're no fun," he complained, letting go of Ophelia. The alpha woman rolled her eyes, moving along in the line. She picked up a bowl from the stack, waiting for her turn to be dished out the elk stew that the chief had made. "So why is it that you two flirt every time you see each other?" Lionel questioned, standing behind her. "Don't generals have different meals prepared for them?" Ophelia avoided the question. "I already ate that," Lionel replied. Ophelia shot him a dirty look. "Greedy old bastard." She complained. "You're as big as me, you know how much people like us need to eat." Lionel defended himself. "I'm not a damn pig about it." Ophelia snapped, annoyed. "Well, apparently someone thinks my hometown is called Pigsty." Lionel responded. Both of them were served their food at the same time. Ophelia and Lionel left the line, and she started to make a beeline to her tent, but Ophelia was grabbed by the back of her collar by Lionel. "Don't think you're getting away that easily, punk." Lionel laughed, dragging her. "Damn it," Ophelia swore with gritted teeth. Due to the relatively equal size to Lionel, Ophelia stood no chance of digging in her heels or overpowering him to get away. So she found herself sitting next to Lionel at a table in his tent. Not the first time she had been dragged here by the old man. But this time, rather than being the usual reasoning of it not being good to eat by yourself, the old bastard wanted to grill her about Darius. "You know, the commander was in a good mood after you left for quite a while." Lionel teased, wagging his spoon at her as he spoke with a mouthful of food. Kept humming to himself while filling out paperwork. Lionel chuckled. "Chew with your mouth closed, you're not a damn animal." Ophelia scolded. "Stop avoiding the topic, kid." Lionel snapped back instantly. "What do you want me to say?" Ophelia snapped. "That I find the commander attractive." "Everyone does, that's why a good chunk of the recruits joined." Ophelia deadpanned, taking another spoonful of stew in her mouth. She chewed and swallowed. She considered her words. She didn't want to sound like she was shaming the commander. So she spoke up again. "Not that I blame him. Using the implied reward of being with him is rather clever and a great way to motivate people to join other than the other benefits," Ophelia remarked thoughtfully. Lionel stared at Ophelia, chewing with his mouth closed, listening to her. Seeing the look on the old man's face, looking amused, Ophelia gave him a sour look. "What?" she asked, glowering at him. "That's the most I've heard you talk, kid." He chuckled, and Ophelia felt her cheeks burning. "Shut the hell up," she snapped, taking another bite of her food. Ophelia took another bite and Lionel spoke up again. "You know he doesn't always act that way during recruitment speeches, right?" He informed Ophelia, and the alpha woman tilted her head, feeling confused. "What are you saying?" Ophelia questioned carefully. "The others might think I'm an idiot. But even an idiot has eyes." Lionel grinned at Ophelia. "What do you mean?" she questioned. Lionel's grin grew. "I saw you two flirting before he even got on stage." Lionel leaned his face onto one of his hands as he rested his elbow on the table. Ophelia's eyes widened. "We were not flirting," Ophelia retorted, looking away. "You might not think so, but Darius did." Lionel chuckled. "The little man was strutting around like a peacock to show off in front of you." He cackled at the surprisingly distant memory, all things considered. "Not that you're any better." Lionel narrowed his eyes at Ophelia. When have I ever shown off in front of him? Ophelia defended herself, but Lionel cut her off. You pulled a damn cart up a hill. Lionel practically shouted, I've never seen Darius have his horse chase after anyone so fast outside of battle. Lionel bellowed, cackling. He was there one moment and the next moment there was just a dust cloud. Ophelia felt her face grow hot. Lionel, who had leaned back to laugh, looked back at Ophelia and went into a laughing fit seeing her expression. Ophelia moved her bowl to the side and folded her arms on top of her head, feeling mortified. This, of course, only caused Lionel's laughter to be louder. Ophelia practically ran out of Lionel's tent when she was done eating. The old alpha man could barely eat from how much he laughed. It was mortifying, but honestly, Ophelia didn't take it to heart. Lionel wasn't the sort to do that for pure meanness. Instead, he passed along the message to not go off by herself because Darius was 3 seconds from jumping her. Ophelia told Lionel he was an idiot as she left. Fine, don't believe me. The general waved her off. Ophelia made a beeline to her tent, passing by the strategy tent as she did. Ophelia felt her cheeks still burning, feeling a tad embarrassed. Maybe she had been flirting with Darius, but it didn't give Lionel the right to point that out. Besides, it wasn't as if the commander thought anything of it. Even if he did find her attractive just like she thought he was, that didn't mean it was going to amount to anything. Back in Flat Trench, plenty of Omegas thought Ophelia was attractive. Her dark skin and dark hair made her stand out from the otherwise pale crowd in the village. She had been the subject of flirting with Omegas countless times. Almost never did they ever develop into anything. Regardless, why would she and Darius ever have anything to do with each other? He was some noble and she was a commoner from a backwoods village. Ophelia ran her fingers through her hair and pulled her hair back into her hair tie. Crazy old bastard. She swore, feeling annoyed that Lionel had put those thoughts in her head. Approaching her tent, she saw some troops being led by General Duval headed south of the camp towards the forest where Ophelia had dispatched the scouting unit. Ophelia stopped and watched for a moment, silently deciding that Duval was likely given a mission to do a raid on the unsuspecting Snowfall army. Earlier, when she was headed off to bathe, she heard in passing soldiers complaining about cleaning up the mess in the woods. The cleanup crew was likely to prevent another scouting unit from finding what Ophelia did. It was better that they thought their men deserted rather than them being beheaded. Seeing the state of the bodies would clue the Snowfall army in on there being an enemy close by. Ophelia watched for a moment as the troop of soldiers disappeared into the night. Duval's troop usually wore darker red tunics and were often used for reconnaissance operations. She almost felt sorry for the poor Snowfall soldiers. Almost, but not enough. Headed into her tent, Ophelia stretched and yawned, finding she felt tired. Flopping down on her bedroll, Ophelia curled up against her pillow, keeping her boots on. It was best to, after all, there was a possibility of a raid. Especially with Snowfall poking around, Ophelia's heavy eyes slowly shut. It was possible they had the same idea as the Imperial army. Ophelia fell asleep shortly after laying on her bedroll. Her mind was filled with the sounds of music and laughter. In her dreams, Ophelia saw dancers dancing around a bonfire as everyone laughed and clapped along to the music. Tiny hands clapped out of time with the music, despite her best efforts. Feeling frustrated, a smaller Ophelia scrambled to her feet. She looked around the crowd looking for someone among the dancers. Then the vision of a woman with dark curly hair just like hers appeared. She danced around and around, her movements were graceful and playful. She heard the sound of beautiful laughter leave her painted lips. Ophelia stood there watching her, finding herself smiling. She had this dream often as a child. While she never saw the face up close, Ophelia knew. She knew exactly who that beautiful woman was. She was her mother, and just as the music stopped, the woman stopped dancing, taking deep breaths. Another laugh left her as a large alpha man approached, hugging her. His skin was darker than Ophelia's and he had twist-out curls on his head. Her father. Ophelia took a step, wanting so much to run up to them. They were so close, she reached her hands out and a childlike voice shouted, "Tata. Mama." She shouted. Her mother and father leaned down with open arms to welcome her in, but just about when Ophelia was able to run into their arms. Her tent collapsed on her in the middle of the night. Ophelia woke with a gasp, surrounded by darkness. The canvas of the tent lay on top of her. Being a stomach sleeper, Ophelia still had room to breathe. Feeling her way through the dark, she struggled until she was able to find the exit. She lifted the fabric of the tent, seeing finely crafted boots first. Confused, Ophelia followed the legs until she was met with the sight of Darius standing there with a wooden stake in his hand. "You know," he said, grinning at her, "the darndest things happen when you kick something hard enough." He teased in a playful tone.